While 80,000 fans were still hoarse from screaming inside American stadiums this summer, a much quieter number was being fought over in conference rooms far away from the cameras. $250 million. That's roughly what Major League Soccer earns every single year from Apple right now, and league executives think that number is embarrassingly low. Behind the trophy lift, behind Spain's celebration on American soil, behind every viral World Cup highlight, there's a business story unfolding that could quietly reshape soccer in the United States more than any single result on the field. MLS wants somewhere between $400 and $500 million a year for its next media rights deal. That's not a modest raise. That's nearly double, maybe close to triple what the league collects today. The timing isn't a coincidence. The World Cup just delivered the biggest American soccer audiences in history. Now, MLS has to prove that wasn't a one-summer sugar rush, but the start of something permanent. Because if the league is wrong, if this bump fades the way tournament bumps so often have before, that $400 to $500 million target turns into a very expensive miscalculation. So how does a league that was collecting $90 million a year barely over a decade ago suddenly believe it deserves $500 million? And can Major League Soccer actually back up the number it's chasing? That's what we're getting into today. To understand where this is heading, you have to understand where it started. Back in 2022, MLS signed a 10-year, $2.5 billion deal with Apple, a deal Commissioner Don Garber called transformational at the time. It replaced a patchwork of broadcast deals worth roughly $90 million a year and moved almost the entire league behind a single streaming paywall called MLS Season Pass. It didn't quite work the way anyone hoped. Viewership numbers were murky for years because Apple almost never released hard data, and the paywall itself became a running joke among American soccer fans who couldn't find games without a subscription. At one point, Garber himself admitted that Apple TV streams were only pulling in around 120,000 unique viewers per match, and even that modest figure was being framed as a 50% improvement. For a league hoping to build the kind of mainstream audience that justifies 9 figures a year, those were rough numbers to sit with. So, late last year, MLS and Apple quietly reworked the whole arrangement, ending it 3 years early, in 2029 instead of 2032, and tearing down the Season Pass paywall entirely. Every Apple TV subscriber now gets MLS at no extra cost, which is essentially an admission that the subscription model wasn't pulling its weight on its own. If you're just finding this channel, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because we're about to get into the numbers that actually explain why this story matters so much. Under the new terms, MLS collects $200 million this year, then a smaller payment tied to a shortened transition season in 2027, followed by $275 million a year for the final 2 seasons of the deal. Add it up, and it's roughly $50 million more than the league would have made under the old schedule. That's the current reality. $400 to $500 million a year is the ambition, and the gap between those two numbers is enormous. Here's where things start getting interesting, because the case MLS is building rests almost entirely on this summer. The league's own 2026 numbers were already trending up before a ball was even kicked at the World Cup, with viewership climbing 62% year over year through the first 3 months of the season, and weekly audiences averaging close to 8 million viewers across streaming and linear television combined. That's the strongest opening stretch in league history. Attendance told a similar story. MLS recorded its highest opening weekend attendance ever in 2026, and Inter Miami alone set a new franchise home attendance record with over 26,000 fans packed in for a single match. Social media engagement kept pace too, with MLS and its clubs reaching close to 113 million followers globally and generating over 5.5 billion impressions through May, up 17% from the year before. Then the World Cup itself arrived and blew every previous benchmark out of the water. The United States' round of 32 win over Bosnia and Herzegovina drew more than 33 million viewers across English and Spanish broadcasts. Mexico versus England averaged over 23 million. These are numbers that sit comfortably next to NFL primetime windows, not typical soccer broadcasts. MLS didn't sit back and let that energy pass it by either. The league deliberately scheduled matches during the World Cup's closing week, putting games on Fox and Apple TV, including a primetime doubleheader right as global attention was locked on American soil. Clubs leaned into it locally too. Chicago's MLS franchise turned a neighborhood bar into a World Cup watch party hub for 5 straight weeks, with an estimated 60,000 people passing through by the time the final whistle blew. Don Garber summed up the mood pretty simply, describing the United States as the golden market for soccer globally, and pointing to what he called unprecedented attendances and unprecedented revenues for FIFA throughout the tournament. On paper, this is exactly the momentum MLS needed heading into a media rights negotiation. And the ripple effects weren't limited to MLS alone. The same surge in interest is expected to lift the National Women's Soccer League and even smaller lower division clubs as newly interested fans look for a local team to follow once the World Cup itself packs up and leaves town. That matters for MLS's pitch too, because a media partner isn't just buying a league, they're buying into an entire growing ecosystem underneath it. Quick pause here. If you're enjoying this breakdown of how the business side of football actually works, subscribing genuinely helps this channel keep making videos like it. Now let's get into the part of this story that MLS doesn't like talking about as much. Because for every number that supports MLS's case, there is another one working against it. The most obvious problem is that nobody outside Apple and the league actually has a clear picture of true viewership. Apple rarely releases specific data, and even the figures that do leak out are hard to compare fairly. The 2025 MLS Cup reportedly drew 4.6 million viewers, but without an average audience figure attached, there's no clean way to stack that against traditional Nielsen ratings for other sports. And the trend line isn't uniformly upward. In 2025, before this year's World Cup bump, MLS actually saw average attendance fall 5.4% to under 22,000 fans per match, with 19 of 29 teams recording declines, more than half of them by 10% or worse. That's the same league now asking media companies to bet $400 to $500 million a year on an upward trajectory. Then there's the competition, and this might be the biggest obstacle of all. The Premier League, La Liga, Liga MX, and the Champions League are all actively chasing the same American audience MLS is counting on. The Premier League in particular has been staging preseason matches on American soil and expanding official watch parties across the country, essentially building its own domestic footprint inside MLS's home market. MLS has internal data showing that 68% of American soccer fans support more than one team, which the league likes to frame as an opportunity. But outside research tells a less flattering version of that story. According to Ampere Analytics, 53% of Premier League fans in the United States don't follow MLS or Liga MX at all. In other words, a lot of the audience MLS wants to convert simply isn't crossing over. And the Premier League isn't standing still while MLS makes its case. Its own American opening weekend recently averaged around 850,000 viewers per game, up year over year, with marquee matchups like Manchester United against Arsenal pulling in roughly 2 million viewers across English and Spanish language broadcasts. That's a foreign league, with games kicking off at inconvenient morning hours for American time zones, still comfortably outperforming a lot of what MLS can show on its own. What MLS still has, and what no European or Mexican league can fully replicate, is the live, in-person experience and genuine local identity. You can stream a Manchester United match from 6,000 miles away, but you can't tailgate outside Old Trafford on a Tuesday night in Ohio. That local connection is the one card MLS holds that its rivals structurally cannot match. And it's also why the league's fan base skews young, with an average age of 39.6, the youngest of any major men's professional sports league in North America. That's exactly the kind of demographic advertisers and streaming platforms tend to pay a premium for. There's also a bigger picture worth considering here, because Apple's interest in MLS was never happening in isolation. The same company has poured hundreds of millions into Friday night baseball broadcasts and has reportedly circled the NFL's Sunday ticket package in the past. Sports content has become one of the clearest ways for tech companies to justify their subscriptions, which means MLS isn't just negotiating on the strength of its own numbers, it's negotiating inside a market where Apple, and potentially Amazon or other challengers, are actively hunting for live sports inventory regardless of the sport attached to it. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good moment, because the next part of the story is about who's actually going to be steering these negotiations, and it's a name a lot of casual fans still don't recognize.
That would be Larry Berg, officially announced as the MLS next commissioner earlier this week, chosen from a pool of around 125 candidates to succeed Don Garber after his 27 years running the league. Berg co-owns LAFC, one of the most respected front offices in MLS, and comes from a private equity background, which tells you a lot about how ownership wants the league's next chapter to be run. Berg takes over officially at the start of next year, and the media rights deal will be one of the very first major tests of his tenure. When reporters pushed him on his strategy during his introductory press conference, he mostly deflected, at one point literally handing the question back to Garber. What he did offer was a philosophy rather than a number, talking about finding media partners willing to, in his words, co-create the future with the league rather than simply outbidding each other.
Berg also floated something that sounds small but hints at how creative these revenue conversations might get, mentioning hydration breaks as a potential financial lever, the same mid-half stoppages that became a talking point during the World Cup itself for their commercial potential. It's a reminder that the eventual number MLS lands on won't come from ratings alone. It'll come from every sellable second of a broadcast. He's not walking into an empty inbox either. Berg will also need to renegotiate the league's collective bargaining agreement with players before it expires at the end of January 2028, alongside growing pressure from owners to loosen MLS's notoriously strict roster rules and spending caps. Those two conversations are deeply connected because a league offering players more financial freedom becomes a much easier league to sell to a broadcaster looking for star power. And there's real money already validating that star power. Inter Miami, powered almost entirely by the Lionel Messi effect since 2023, has seen its revenue nearly quadruple and is now valued between $1.4 and $1.6 billion, the most valuable club in the league. LAFC became the first MLS franchise to cross the billion-dollar mark years ago. Even San Diego FC, an expansion club that only joined in 2025 after paying a league record $500 million entry fee, is already valued at nearly $800 million. Across all 30 franchises, the league's combined value now sits somewhere around $23 billion. That's the strange contradiction sitting at the center of this whole story. Investors are pricing MLS like a league on the verge of a breakthrough. Media companies are being asked to do the same thing, except with actual cash up front, and a lot less certainty about whether the audience sticks around once the World Cup afterglow fades. Before we get into where this actually heads next, if this kind of deep dive into football's business side is your thing, subscribing means you won't miss the next one. So what happens from here? And if you're watching this and you still haven't tapped that subscribe button, this is your sign, because the next 12 months of this story are going to move fast. MLS is also in the middle of one of the biggest structural changes in its history, shifting from its traditional spring to fall calendar to a summer to spring format that aligns with the rest of the world, starting with a shortened transition season in early 2027 before the new full calendar kicks off that July. That change alone is meant to make MLS easier to slot into the global soccer conversation, syncing transfer windows and reducing the awkward mid-season pauses that used to interrupt the league every time a major international tournament rolled around. The best-case outcome for MLS is fairly straightforward. Viewership keeps climbing instead of settling back down, the calendar switch goes smoothly, a handful of marquee signings keep the league in headlines the way Messi did, and multiple bidders, not just Apple, show real interest when formal negotiations begin. In that version of events, landing somewhere near the top of that $400 to $500 million range starts to look realistic, especially if the league sells rights across multiple partners instead of one exclusive streaming deal. The worst realistic outcome is the one MLS has lived through before. The World Cup bump proves temporary. Attendance and ratings drift back toward where they sat in 2025, and the league is forced to accept something closer to a modest bump over its current $275 million figure, rather than the doubling it's hoping for. Many industry observers expect the truth to land somewhere in between, a meaningful increase built on genuine, if smaller than advertised, audience growth, likely split across a streaming partner and at least one traditional broadcaster, the way several major American sports leagues already structure their rights deals. That kind of split, part exclusive streaming, part free-to-air linear television, is exactly the direction Berg's comments about co-creating with partners seem to be hinting at, rather than repeating the single-partner, one-app model that made MLS so hard to find over the last few years. Nothing here is decided yet. Berg himself has said negotiations won't seriously begin until closer to the 2029 deadline, which gives MLS a few more seasons to either prove its case or watch the story quietly deflate.
What we do know is that this is one of the biggest financial storylines in American soccer heading into the next few years, and it's playing out almost entirely outside the spotlight the World Cup created. The tournament gave MLS its best commercial argument in league history. Whether that argument survives contact with a boardroom of media executives in 2029 is a completely different question. So here's what I want to know from you. Do you think this World Cup bump is the real deal, or does it fade the way soccer's American moments so often have before? Would you actually pay for a standalone MLS subscription if it came to that? And out of MLS, the Premier League, and Liga MX, who do you think actually wins the fight for the American soccer fan long term? Drop your take in the comments. I read every single one. If you enjoyed today's football business breakdown, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Football never stops, and neither do we. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.